evening. I'm Jennifer Lowe. I'm the Director of Programs and Strategic Planning at the Supreme Court Historical Society. I'm delighted to welcome you to our virtual platform for today's program with Professors Brad Snyder and Kenneth Mack to discuss Brad's new book, You Can't Kill a Man Because of the Books He Reads, Angelo Herndon's Fight for Free Speech, which was published this week by W.W. Norton and Company. I will briefly introduce them and then turn over our virtual platform for their conversation. Brad is the St. Thomas More Professor in Law and History and the Anne Fleming Research Professor at Georgetown Law. He is the author of Democratic Justice, Felix Frankfurter, the Supreme Court, and the Making of the Liberal Establishment, The House of Truth, A Washington Political Salon, and the Foundations of American Liberalism, and A Well-Paid Slave, Curt Flood's Fight for Free Agency in Professional Sports. He is a member of the Society's Board of Editors for our Journal of Supreme Court History. Ken Mack is the inaugural Lawrence D. Beale Professor of Law and Affiliate Professor of History at Harvard University. He's also the co-faculty leader of the Harvard Law Program on Law and History. He's the author of Representing the Race, the creation of the Civil Rights Lawyer. He's also the co-editor of In Between and Across, Legal History Without Boundaries. Both Brad and Ken have been longtime supporters of the Society, and it's a delight to bring them together tonight. We will be taking questions from the audience, so please share your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for having us here. You do a great job with the programs of the Society. I wanted to thank all my friends at the Supreme Court Historical Society, but I especially want to thank Ken Mack for taking time out to do this with me. As I wrote you, Ken, on email, were a few people and their books that I was kind of in a conversation with in my head as I was writing this book. And Representing the Race was at the top of the list. I mean, your work on Black lawyers, J. Clay Smith's work on Black lawyers, they were books I just kept going back to again and again. And I'm just really delighted to be here with you and to talk about Angelo Herndon and the lawyers who were involved in the case.
Well, that's great. Thank you also, Brad, for such a wonderful book. This has been a subject that's been near and dear to my own heart for many years, and I realized how little I knew about something I thought I knew a lot about in reading your book. And also thank the Historical Society for inviting me. They've been wonderful to include me in various things over the years, and it's a pleasure to be here. I thought just for the audience's sake, maybe we could just start with you introducing them to both the book and Herndon's case. And, because what's interesting is that if we were in the middle of the 1930s, of course, this case would need no introduction. Our audience would have read about it in whatever form of media they consume regularly. This is a case that really transfixed people in the middle of the 1930s, but now is mostly sort of known to people who do civil rights history or constitutional law or the history of free speech. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of time to talk about the book and about the story.
Sure. Well, you're completely right about that. That's such a great observation. I mean, I tell people Angelo Herndon was one of the most famous Black people in America in the 1930s, that everyone knew who Angelo Herndon was in the 1930s, and everyone knew who the so-called Scottsboro Boys were, the 9 young Black men who were falsely accused of raping 2 white women. And their cases are really, I think, connected, both in terms of they were both represented by the International Labor Defense, which is the legal arm of the Communist Party. They were similar and different. I think the Scottsboro Boys case, the Scottsboro case, was much more tragic because they spent much more time in prison. But Herndon was a Black Communist Party organizer. He was between 18 or 19 years old when he was sent from Birmingham to Atlanta. And Atlanta had some great and terrible things about it at the time. The great thing about it was they had wonderful Black universities, a thriving Black middle class, but it was also a very repressive place for Black people and for people on the far left. 6 communist organizers had already been arrested in Atlanta before Angelo Herndon got arrested and charged under the same slave insurrection statute. Herndon was charged. He led shortly after he got there. This is the height of the Great Depression, 1932. The Fulton County officials decide we're going to end all unemployment relief, all $6,000 of it. And people were going to starve. This was front page news, even in white newspapers, that they were cutting off all unemployment relief, like the Atlanta Constitution. Herndon organized a peaceful interracial protest on June 30th, 1932, in front of the Fulton County Courthouse. People were talking amiably with police officers. There was no incident afterwards. In fact, a few days after this peaceful interracial protest, Fulton County officials reversed their stance and reinstated the $6,000 in unemployment relief. Well, on July 11th, 1932, Herndon goes to the post office to pick up the Communist Party's mail at their mailbox, and he was arrested by 2 police officers. The officers seized all of the communist literature under his arm. They forced him to go to his rented room and search that room without a warrant. And then they held him incommunicado in the Fulton County Jail for 2 weeks without charging him with any crime. Finally, a judge said, you either need to charge him or release him. And that's when they charged Herndon with attempting to incite insurrection under an old Georgia slave insurrection statute. And from there, the story kind of takes off. And, and starts really a 5-year legal odyssey. This is a capital crime, right? Herndon could be sentenced to death for attempting to incite insurrection and just trying to get Herndon representation because he was a communist, because he was Black, and because this is 1932 Atlanta, Georgia, with a very repressive police force and prosecutors and a lot of white violence against Black people and against the Communist Party. So it was really hard to find any good lawyer to represent Herndon, and I think that was really the initial challenge and one of the initially fascinating things for me about the case. Ken, you're muted.
It's wonderful. I mean, one of the things that's so fascinating about the case is, he is a communist organizer. He's Black. He's charged under this insurrection statute. And you might think in the course of the 1930s, nobody would take up his cause. But as you so ably show in your book, sort of more and more people over time come to take up his cause, from Black lawyers like, the Ben Davis, who's one of his trial lawyers, to Charles Houston of the NAACP, to Elbert Tuttle, the famous future federal judge. Tell me a little bit about the figures who were drawn into Angelo Herndon's case, and why did all these people get involved?
Yeah, well, let me give you one more example, right? The famous historian C. Vann Woodward was a Georgia Tech English instructor, just out of having recently graduated from Emory University, and he took up Herndon's cause at Georgia Tech and lost his job at Georgia Tech probably because of budget cuts in the English department shortly after he got involved. But he certainly ticked off the president of Georgia Tech, gave him a talking to for getting involved in trying to free Angelo Herndon. Woodward it was an interesting story. He had traveled through Europe and the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, and everywhere he went, people asked him about the case, the Scottsboro case, and about the way people were being treated in the American South. And he was worried, like with the case of the other 6 communists, the so-called Atlanta 6, that this was going to really not just give the South a black eye, but give kind of even white liberals who were working for kind of racial justice set their efforts back a long time. And he just was a civil libertarian, Woodward, and so I think people were sort of outraged that Herndon was charged with doing something that was part of their kind of First Amendment rights, right, to be able to peaceably assemble and free speech. And I think that really that really galvanized people kind of across the political spectrum, right? You have Republicans and Democrats who get involved in his case. You have communists and not communists, and you have people who usually won't work with the Communist Party get involved in his case, like the NAACP, and I hope we'll talk some about that. There was, I think, just something about his case, and maybe just about him, right? As that just kind of captured people's imagination.
Mhm. Yeah, and let me start with another one of these people who winds up being drawn into the case, Ben Davis Jr., who, if people in our audience know anything about him, they would know that he was one of the leaders of the American Communist Party, subsequently indicted under the Smith Act and sent to jail essentially for being a communist. Um, but what you show so wonderfully in this book is that Ben Davis is a lawyer. And not only is he a lawyer, he's a Harvard Law School graduate, and he's gone to Amherst College, and he's from the Black upper class in Atlanta. And he's like a bunch of other Black lawyers in this period, like Charles Hamilton Houston, who worked at the lead lawyer for the NAACP, William Hastie, the same thing, future federal judge, who have similar backgrounds but don't become communists. So tell me a little bit about Davis. How does he wind up in the case? Why does he become a communist? What's his story?
Yeah, Ben Davis Jr. is one of the most prominent African American men in Atlanta. He's the head of I think it's I'm going to get it wrong right now, but he's the head of, he has his own newspaper, the Atlanta Independent. So he's the editor of the Atlanta Independent, but where he was quite powerful was Ben Davis's father, Ben Davis Sr., was a Republican National Committeeman in Georgia. And when Harding and Coolidge and Hoover were in power, that gave Ben Davis Sr. a lot of power over federal political patronage in Georgia. So he has this newspaper. He's a Republican National Committee man, and then whites force the Republican Party to basically oust his father as a Republican National Committee man. And so Davis becomes disillusioned with the Republican Party, right? And the Democratic Party is basically in Georgia is full of white supremacists. So the Democratic Party is a non-starter. But as someone who was, firmly in that Black middle class, right, in Atlanta, I think Davis couldn't find his way almost. He had come back home to study for the Georgia bar, right? He had worked for a time as a journalist in Baltimore and Chicago, and he comes back home. He studies for the Georgia bar. He starts his own law firm with another young Black lawyer named John Gear, and I think Herndon's case showed him that Black people could not get a fair shake in Atlanta. And Ken, your book, I mean, you left so many great breadcrumbs in representing the race. You pointed me to a letter in 1932. This is long before Herndon's trial, where Ben Davis is writing Charles Hamilton Houston, who had also gone to Amherst College, right, and who had finished at the top of his class at Amherst College, and who had gone to Harvard Law School, as you know, and became the first Black member of the Harvard Law Review, and was, a good bit older than Herndon, but yet they were close. Their fathers were friends, and so they were in the same sort of milieu. And Herndon writes this letter to Houston about everything he had learned, and it was almost like he had been enlightened about what he had learned about the Communist Party. And so you could see almost in real time in this letter Ben Davis Jr.'s sort of radicalization and move toward the communists. And the narrative that Davis tells is that, well, I only became a communist after, that all-white jury convicted Angelo Herndon. Well, that letter shows that there's an element of untruth, or maybe it was a good story, but the facts were a little different, and your work sort of helped me with that. But I was really fascinated by him also in that, unlike Houston, who was an incredibly accomplished lawyer and defended Black people in the South in Loudoun County, right, Virginia, in a murder case, long before Thurgood Marshall was going into the South and doing that. Ben Davis Jr. had never tried a criminal case when he tries Herndon's case, and his partner John Gear had never tried a criminal case, and I think that presented some problems.
Yeah. So, couple of other aspects of this case that would be fascinating for a modern day audience. So two big legal issues emerge from the case. At the trial, there's this question of exclusion of Black jurors. And of course, to us, this seems kind of crazy. Of course, you can't exclude jurors because of race. You can't just decide that Black people can't serve on juries. And second, because he's charged under this insurrection law that's sort of vaguely worded, and the Georgia Supreme Court has to interpret it. The other issue that winds up before the courts is free speech. But why don't we just, either pick one of those two issues, or maybe the jury exclusion issue, and we also are really used to the federal constitution applying in state courts, so that, right, I don't know if the Massachusetts legislature decided that it was going to exclude Black people from juries, or the local prosecutor in Boston, that the federal constitution would prevent that. So tell me a little bit about the background of the claims that are being made in this case, and why
Yeah,
they're so unfamiliar to us.
yeah, great questions. The ILD, the International Labor Defense, the legal arm of the Communist Party, really wanted to press the issue of the exclusion of Black people on juries. And you can see why. Because if they could win a major victory, it wouldn't just set Herndon free, but it would enable Black people throughout the American South, right, to get fairer trials, right? It would actually give them maybe a fighting chance of winning if Black people were on juries. And in Fulton County at the time, and this came out during discovery in Herndon's case, white people's names were put on white slips of paper, and Black people's names were put on yellow slips of paper. And Fulton County continued to do this for 20 years after Herndon's case, right? It wasn't until a 1953 Supreme Court decision called Avery versus Georgia, where Chief Justice Vinson finally overturned a conviction because of the exclusion of Black jurors. But in 1933, that issue of jury exclusion frightened people. It frightened white lawyers in Atlanta, one of whom agreed to take the case. And then once he realized that's the only issue the ILD wanted to press, he says, I'm out of here. He took his retainer with him and left. And then I think also the most prominent Black lawyer, whom we haven't talked about yet, but Ken, I know you know him well, is A.T. Walden, right? And A.T. Walden was Ben Davis Jr.'s mentor in Atlanta. He was the head of the Atlanta NAACP chapter. He was a University of Michigan law graduate. And, he was a very able lawyer. He had worked on other criminal cases and in habeas corpus proceedings throughout the federal courts. He could have easily represented Herndon, but I think he too was scared off by this jury issue, and by a refusal to work with the Communist Party. I think he was worried that the communists were going to use Herndon's case solely for publicity, and were not interested in making legal arguments that would actually set him free. And so Walden didn't take the case, and that's why Ben Davis Jr. got the case. And of course, there was some controversy about that, because Will Alexander, who was the head of the Committee on Interracial Cooperation, insisted that Walden had never been asked, and Ben Davis, who needs money, is telling Roger Nash Baldwin at the ACLU, he's the head of the ACLU, Walden wouldn't take the case. You have to help me, right? I'm your best hope here. Nobody else would take the case. And so, that jury issue, I think, was frightening to people in Atlanta, and it was a winning issue, right? And of course, in the Scottsboro case, in Norris versus Alabama, right, the exclusion of black jurors in that case was won them new trials, right, in that case. So it was a smart strategy, but once Ben Davis Jr. decided to hold a pretrial hearing on the jury issue, and once the white powers that be, the prosecutors, caught wind of it, they immediately put two blacks into the jury pool in a different case. And those two black jurors were struck by defense counsel, but they were able to say that black people could serve on juries in Fulton County. So that claim was somewhat factually undermined. And then Davis, who was not an experienced appellate lawyer, did not properly preserve the objections on those jury claims. What's kind of a mystery, Ken, just going back to your question, is that they didn't even raise First Amendment claims at, pre-trial or at trial. And today we would think, well, why didn't you raise free speech and assembly claims? And I think that answer is complicated. One is, you know this, many lawyers know this, but the First Amendment did not apply to the states. The free speech and free press portions of the First Amendment did not apply to the states until 1925. And, the first time the Supreme Court overturned a conviction on free speech grounds from a state court was in 1931. So this was a really kind of new avenue for a lot of lawyers, and they didn't pursue it until it was almost too late.
Okay, so let me as you mentioned, a lawyer named A.T. Walden is, very well-respected black lawyer in Atlanta. He's a civil rights lawyer, but a very respectable civil rights lawyer who kind of figures out how to get things done without always sort of, sticking his finger in the eyes of whites. And Walden, is associated with Davis, but doesn't want to be associated with this case. I want to just start taking maybe a question from the audience just to advance us a little bit. As you demonstrate in the book, Davis, assisted by another black lawyer, does defend Herndon at trial. Herndon is convicted. Under the insurrection statute, you can be sentenced to death, but he actually gets sentenced to the chain gang. So tell us a little bit about what happens afterwards. And our question specifically is, that Herndon was sentenced to hard labor in the chain gang instead of the death penalty. And our questioner asks, did he spend time on a chain gang? Or more generally, what happens to Angelo Herndon after he's convicted, as you really very richly describe in the book?
Well, it was that all-white jury that convicts Herndon, I think, realizes that he shouldn't die for what he did. And so they recommend to the judge that he get 18 to 20 years on a chain gang, because that's what the statute allows for. But no, he never serves any time on the chain gang while his case is going up on appeal. And it was a very complicated appellate process, but the short answer is they go up on appeal and try to raise a First Amendment issue at the Georgia Supreme Court and with the United States Supreme Court, but they hadn't properly raised those First Amendment claims at trial. And so the Supreme Court of the United States in 1935 says, you lose on jurisdictional grounds, right? They just dismiss the case, say we don't have federal jurisdiction here, right? So Herndon gets bail, right? So while his case is pending on appeal, the Communist Party in the pages of the Daily Worker, through like contributions of, bonds and, pennies and dimes and dollars. They raised this huge amount of money for Herndon to go out on bail as his appeal is pending. But once he then loses at the Supreme Court of the United States, he goes back to jail, goes back to Fulton Tower Prison. He doesn't go to the chain gang immediately because then they then go back into an Atlanta trial court because the local counsel, a guy named Elbert Tuttle, right, the future Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals judge and civil rights hero, is a local lawyer in Atlanta. He knows a judge with a guilty conscience. And that's a judge named Hugh Dorsey, who had prosecuted Leo Frank, right, the Jewish Atlanta pencil factory worker who was convicted of the murder of Mary Fagan, sentenced to death. Governor commuted his sentence to life in prison, and then he was subsequently lynched by, broken out of prison and lynched. And I think Judge Dorsey, I think, at least in the eyes of Elbert Tuttle thought he had a guilty conscience. And as governor, because Dorsey became governor after he prosecuted Leo Frank, he was actually a racially progressive governor. And then Dorsey then grants Herndon habeas corpus for the reasons that you suggested, Ken. He said that this statute's too vague, right? You can't send someone to 18 to 20 years of hard labor based on this vague statute. Case goes back up to the Georgia Supreme Court, and then it goes up to the United States Supreme Court. Meanwhile, you have a dream team of appellate lawyers come in. You have Carol Weiss King, who is a remarkable radical lawyer for the ILD. She's sort of the point guard of the legal team, and she basically takes these two young Columbia University professors, Herbert Wexler and Walter Gellhorn, and said, "Will you help me work on the appellate briefs?" And they say, "Yeah, but you need someone to argue this case before the Supreme Court of the United States." And they get kind of the ultimate Republican patrician lawyer in Whitney North Seymour from Simpson Thatcher, former Assistant Solicitor General, and he argues the case twice before the United States Supreme Court. And then they win 5-4, right, on free speech and assembly grounds. Owen Roberts, 2 weeks after West Coast Hotel versus Parrish. So for the non-lawyers in the audience, Roosevelt tries to pack the Supreme Court in February of 1937, and the Supreme Court stops overruling state and federal economic legislation and state minimum wage laws, and kind of that case, which was dubbed the switch in time that saves 9, where Roberts decides to uphold a minimum wage law, that sort of puts a damper on this idea of court packing, right? And a few weeks later, Owen Roberts writes another 5-4 decision in Herndon's case and says his conviction violates not the statute, but his conviction, sort of as applied to him, violated his rights to free speech and assembly. And so that's what happens in the case.
Okay, so before I ask the next question, what I want to do is just remind the audience that they can submit their questions. I think I don't actually see the mechanism, but they show up in the Q&A here, because we're going to leave some time near the end for more questions from the audience. So please think about what you want to ask Professor Snyder and submit your questions, and we'll take them up. So this is a fascinating case, right? So kind of winds up in the Supreme Court twice. The second time there really is a substantive decision. His conviction is overturned on free speech and freedom of assembly grounds. And as you say in the book and make clear that, this is kind of a newish thing at the time for Supreme Court to be doing this. But then Angelo Herndon, one of the mysteries of this case has always been, for those of us who know a lot about it, like, what happened to Angelo Herndon? Like, we kind of know he was famous. He writes an autobiography afterwards. But the thing about him, and I don't know if the audience actually gets to see a picture of him, he looks fantastically young. He always looks fantastically young. Brad, you have a picture of him from 1969. I'm like, wait a minute, that's what he looks like at 69? That could have been like 1932.
Yeah.
So, but he is fantastically young, and he's famous, Like people have heard of him all across the world, all across the country, and actually even across the world. Um, and and he comes to New York, and I think you've got I might get this wrong. Like there's a rally with 20,000 people in New York. And so about how old is he when this case is done? And he's famous. So what does he
he's like
do?
21, 22, maybe,
Yes.
right? I actually think he was a year. I think part of the reason Kenny looks so young is having gone through the Alabama birth records. I think he was actually a year younger than
Oh.
his birth certificate says. So I think when they say he was a 19-year-old black communist, I think he was an 18-year-old black communist, based on the birth records attributed
Mhm.
to his parents and with the exact day of birth,
Yeah.
May 6th. So I think he was born May 6th, 1914, instead of May 6th, 1913. So he was even younger than we thought, right, at the time. But yeah, you're right. He is super famous after the Supreme Court rules in his favor. Um, there's a mural in Moynihan Hall, for those of you who go through the Northeast Corridor on Amtrak, of Herndon being carried out by a crowd of the old Penn Station, right? It's just a remarkable scene, and there's terrific photographs, one of which is in my book, of just the throng of people who are inspired in New York. Communists and non-communists, white people and black people, who are really inspired by his decision. And Herndon, to his credit, I think capitalizes on that fame, right? As you said, while his case was pending, he writes a book and Random House publishes it. It gets rave reviews in the New York Herald Tribune and the New York Times, right? And then he goes to New York and he ends up befriending a young daily worker writer named Richard Wright, right? The author of Native Son and Black Boy, for those of you who've read his work. And so he befriends Richard Wright, and then the editor of the Daily Worker in New York is his former trial counsel, Ben Davis Jr., and Herndon eventually goes and works for Ben Davis Jr. as a writer on the Daily Worker. There are not too many black people working for daily newspapers in New York in 1937. He actually takes over Richard Wright's job as sort of the Harlem correspondent for the Daily Worker. And and from there, he starts an amazing periodical called the Negro Quarterly, which is a kind of journal of Black life and culture and politics, and it's kind of Pan-Africanist before that word was really in vogue, right? It was just an amazing um, piece of work. And after the first issue, he hires this young writer who's also struggling to make his way in New York as managing editor, is Ralph Ellison, right? And so he and Ellison are editing this publication. He's on top of the world, and then he disappears, right? And Charles Martin wrote a book about Herndon that's really terrific and it's very well researched. I read it in my sophomore year of college in Professor Raymond Gavin's African American history class, and I wanted to know ever since I read Charles Martin's book what happened to Angelo Herndon, and that was sort of a mystery for me that I was sort of intent on tracking down, and I had no idea where it would lead. The only thing I knew about Herndon between about 1940 was that he died in 1997 in Sweet Home, Arkansas. That's the only thing I knew. And then I just started digging, right? And tried to find out. And it's some of the story is sad, right? But not all of it is sad, in my opinion. Some people said they thought the story was a sad ending, but I didn't think so. I didn't take it quite that way. Um, I think Herndon makes. I don't think anybody else had known this. Herndon makes a triumphant return to Harlem, right? In the late '60s, to honor Ben Davis Jr. of all people, after Ben Davis Jr. had passed away, and to celebrate the publication of Ben Davis Jr.'s autobiography, which had been seized by prison authorities. So to me, that was an amazing moment in the book.
Yeah, yeah, that's really fascinating. I mean, as you say, none of us knew really what happened to Angelo Herndon. And there's a way in which he kind of lived an ordinary life. It wasn't necessarily tragic. Um, but fill us in a little bit. So he's famous, And at some point he will quote unquote disappears, which just means he's like becomes unfamous. He's not kind of in the newspapers, no longer editing the Negro Quarterly. How does he become unfamous, and what does he do with the rest of his, you're famous at age 21, like world famous. What does he do with the rest of his life? How does he make decisions? What does he do?
Well, I mean, first of all, he splits with the Communist Party, right? And I think the publication of the Negro Quarterly with Ralph Ellison, I think, caused some real tension with the Communist Party, which of course had gone through multiple phases. And by the 1940s, right, once Germany invades Russia, right, the Communist Party is on the side of the Allies because they want the United States and their allies to protect Russia. And so what that publication, Negro Quarterly, would be called at the time was Black nationalism. And that was a no-no for the Communist Party, which of course believed in just a interracial class struggle, right? So he had really fallen out of favor with the Communist Party. And then his draft number came up, and he tried to get an exemption for being the editor of the Negro Quarterly. He said he was helping the war effort. And there was a lot written about the war in the Negro Quarterly, but he was saying he was trying to help Black people get behind the war effort by publishing the Negro Quarterly. And this guy in the draft board in New York wasn't having any of it. And I think the black eye the Communist Party got from Herndon being perceived in the pages of the New York World Telegram, which was a very anti-communist newspaper, as dodging the draft. They parted ways with Herndon. He goes out to the West Coast, tries to reestablish himself tries to keep the Negro Quarterly going, tries to start a black newspaper out in San Francisco. Herndon's Achilles heel is he had a problem with money. And what I mean by he had a problem with money was it's not that he just liked to spend it. It's that he liked to take other people's money and not give it back. And he would borrow money and not pay people back. Or he would borrow money under false pretenses and not pay it back. And that, I think, happened in Harlem. It happened in San Francisco. And it ultimately becomes his undoing in Chicago. And he gets convicted of fraud.
Mhm.
So, it's that, I think, that was kind of his Achilles heel, was he wasn't trustworthy when it came to financial matters. And but I think he was somewhat adrift. The Communist Party was his identity, right? It was his education, right? It was how he was well known. It was how he became famous. And I think when he wasn't affiliated with the Communist Party anymore, he really struggled, both financially, but also I think kind of psychologically struggled just to figure out where he fit in. So I was sympathetic to him. You know that all of our heroes are not perfect, right? Everybody we write about has flaws, and Herndon had flaws, and those flaws really caused his undoing it. And I do what you do, Ken. I just go to archives and I just befriend archivists. And there was an archivist at the National Archives in Chicago who said, "Oh yeah, I found, what happened. I know what happened to Angelo Herndon, right? I'm making FOIA requests, all over the country about Herndon. My lawyer at Georgetown, David Vladeck, eventually had to sue the National Archives to get his FBI file. We're still in litigation about trying to get redactions on his FBI file. But and finally, this wonderful archivist at National Archives said, "Oh yeah, I've got a hit on Herndon here in Chicago," and it was a federal criminal trial for fraud for trying to sell the same apartment building to 2 or 3 different people, and then I saw the appellate papers and everything else, and that was just sad, but it also gave me a window into what Herndon's life was like in Chicago and what he was doing there. And then, of course, once I eventually got Herndon's FBI file, Hoover, very early on, was probably, I'd say, in the late 30s, maybe 36, 37, had opened a file on Herndon. And it's following him and following and following him all the way until 1972, long after he was famous, right after he became a normal person. But even the FBI lost track of him couldn't find him, and Herndon just kind of disappears, right? He crops up every now and then. He cropped up in Milwaukee, and but as you said, he worked very hard not to be found by people, because other historians, I think, tried to track him down, and he did not want to be found. I really wish I could have interviewed him. And he was also estranged from his family. I think one of the things I wish I'd made clearer in the book was, because I've talked to some of his relatives, and he was estranged from, his brothers. I imagine, my hypothesis is that because he probably borrowed money from them and didn't pay them back, because that was sort of his modus operandi, in the 30s and 40s.
Mm-hmm. So let me take another one of our questions from the audience. The question is, I mean, you've said a little bit about this, but maybe you could elaborate. The question is, what inspired you to work on this case? What made this interesting, compelling? What did you want to accomplish when you started the book? Did you accomplish it?
Well, I thought that, as you mentioned earlier, Ken, the cast of characters, right? When you have kind of C. Vann Woodward, right, as a young man interested in the case, you have a really Ben Davis Jr., who's an incredibly complex and fascinating story, and his job as trial counsel to Herndon, and then, of course, being in the United States, and being one of the Communist 10 who's convicted under federal law and goes to prison right near the end of his life. So that was Ben Davis Jr.'s story was fascinating. Carol Weiss King is an amazing radical lawyer. Her brother started Paul Weiss, right? She takes a totally different path and spends her entire life defending radicals and immigrants from deportation. So she's a great character, and then just looking at like a young Herbert Wechsler, and being able to write about a young Herbert Wechsler and what's motivating him off of his clerkship from Harlan Fiske Stone. And I think really it's that Scottsboro case that comes up during Wechsler's clerkship, Powell versus Alabama, right? That first Supreme Court decision about the Scottsboro case, how they had inadequate representation at their first trial. I think that made a huge impression on a young Herbert Wechsler. And then being able to write about Charlie Houston, right, who I think is one of the most fascinating Black lawyers of the 20th century. I think he's, for me, one of the most compelling lawyers of the 20th century. And seeing the way Houston, unlike A.T. Walden, who we had talked about earlier, who wanted nothing to do with the Communist Party, Houston was willing to work with the Communist Party, even though his bosses at the NAACP wanted nothing to do with the Communist Party. Houston wasn't afraid. And so he worked closely with Carol Weiss King, and he really convinced the NAACP as an organization, even though they had lost the representation of the Scottsboro Nine to the communists, right? And felt kind of burned. He said, you have to get in on the Herndon case. The Herndon case is everything we stand for as an organization. And that just kind of gave me chills when I read that letter, because he realized that if Black organizations like the NAACP, if the civil rights movement did not have the right to free speech and peaceable assembly, then the movement could not exist, right? And so, he saw this case as bigger than Herndon. And I'm just so kind of inspired by Houston's career and what he accomplished, and the obstacles that he had to overcome, and just the way he navigated different organizations, and he's so courageous, and not enough lawyers and not enough law students know who Charles Hamilton Houston is.
Okay. Yeah, and I was always in reading your book, there, as you said, there are all these people who come up in Herndon's story who somehow came up in my own research. Like Carol Weiss King. I remember she and Houston have this correspondence in the 1940s, and she's running this thing called the International Juridical Association. And like, I'm trying to figure out who she is, but I never really had time to sort of figure it out. So I read more about her in your book. So it is this fascinating cast of characters who really gets drawn into the story. Many of whom we should know a whole lot more about than we do. Let me take another one of our questions from the audience. And this one says, can you talk about how the Supreme Court decisions came about? Which I think means, you know, there's a lot of procedural maneuvering to get Herndon's case before the court. At first, the court doesn't take it. A lot of people get involved in trying to figure out how to get the court to take it and how to get um, the free speech issues, which were kind of not raised in the trial below, as you say, in part because they're kind of new, and in part because Ben Davis's co-counsel are pretty inexperienced, you know. Tell me a little bit about how they get to the Supreme Court and what is that narrative and what are the obstacles in getting there, and and um and why does this become an attractive case for somebody like Owen Roberts, to write an opinion?
Such great questions. Thanks for elaborating on that. Well, the procedural answers are really complicated, but Herbert Wexler, I sort of credit Wexler with this idea. For those of you who don't know who Herbert Wexler is, he's like the godfather of federal jurisdiction. His book, Hart and Wexler, is still the leading case book for any law student who's taking a federal courts class in their second and third year. And it was Wexler who figured out a way to raise these First Amendment issues. And what he did was, and what Herndon's appellate counsel did was, they asked for a petition for rehearing before the Georgia Supreme Court. And so initially they asked for that petition for rehearing because they thought the Georgia Supreme Court's first decision conflicted with United States Supreme Court precedent on the First Amendment. They're like, hey, if you're going to charge somebody with incitement, you have to have a clear and present danger of imminent physical harm or violence, right? Imminent violence. And you're not following that standard. So you need to rehear this case. And to a lot of people's surprise, the Georgia Supreme Court wrote a second opinion. So in the first time it went up to the Supreme Court of the United States, Herndon's legal team, King, Wexler, Whitney North Seymour, they argued we have jurisdiction. We did properly raise this First Amendment issue because the Georgia Supreme Court got it wrong. And when the Georgia Supreme Court gets the First Amendment wrong for the first time, that enables us to raise it in the United States Supreme Court. Well, the U.S. Supreme Court didn't buy that argument in 1935. And so usually, like today, I'm pretty sure under Georgia law, the case would be procedurally barred from going back into the Georgia courts and raising the First Amendment issue for the first time back in a trial court. But that's exactly what they did before Hugh Dorsey. They filed another petition for habeas corpus challenging the constitutionality of Herndon's conviction, and they raised these First Amendment issues for the first time. They take that First Amendment issue back up to the Georgia Supreme Court, who says, no, you lose again, right? And then by that point, not even the Georgia authorities are contesting the idea that the First Amendment issue has been properly raised. When they go back to the court in 1937, it's on the merits of those First Amendment claims. And so then you ask me a great question. Why Owen Roberts, right? Owen Roberts is not considered one of the great Supreme Court justices, right? He was only on the court for about 15 years from 1930 to 1945. He resigns from the court really in disgust with his colleagues. They can't even agree on the congratulatory letter to Owen Roberts when he resigns. He's not really thought of as one of the great justices, and he's really perceived, I think, perhaps wrongly, that he caved to pressure of Franklin Roosevelt's court packing plan and kind of began changing his views in response but his votes had taken place on West Coast Hotel versus Parrish, which is about the Washington State minimum wage law. Helen Knowles Gardner wrote a great book on this case, right? He had cast those votes in December of 36 before Roosevelt had even introduced that court packing plan. It was just a mere accident that Harlan Fistone was sick and couldn't appear for them to announce a decision. But I have a different view kind of on Owen Roberts. He might not be the most technically proficient justice or the best writer who's ever written opinions for the Supreme Court of the United States, but he was real willing to stand up. And he had a real sense of injustice, I think. And he famously dissented in the case of Fred Korematsu, who was convicted for not reporting to a Japanese relocation camp in that famous case where they upheld Korematsu's conviction and also upheld the constitutionality, the Supreme Court of the United States, of Japanese internment. It's really one of the worst decisions of the 20th century. And Owen Roberts is the one that said, hey, these are concentration camps. You can't do this. You can't jail somebody just because of their ethnicity, right? And so that was, what, in the 40s, right? After the Herndon case. But there were other cases between Herndon's case and Korematsu, suspected communists, cases that Carol Weiss King and Herbert Wexler and Whitney North Seymour were litigating, where Owen Roberts writes the majority opinion in favor of those suspected communists. So I'm not going to say he's underrated, but I think that he has a sense of injustice. Was he right all the time? No, he was totally wrong on the all white primary cases, right? He was on the wrong side of Smith versus Allwright, so he didn't get all the cases right. But I think he's outraged by cases like Herndon's or Fred Korematsu's, where people are being convicted because of the color of their skin.
Okay, great. Let me take this next question, and I'm going to, this is such a fascinating story, right? It feels like, a story that everybody should want to read. So I'll take this next question in that spirit. And the question is, why isn't this a movie?
I think that's one of my colleagues at Georgetown who wrote that question, because she asked me that, and a couple of my colleagues at Georgetown asked me that. I don't know. I think the end of the Herndon case, right? There's a kind of catch me if you can element of the Herndon case at the end. Kind of he becomes kind of a confidence man right at the end. And I think that hurts the case. But what I think is great about the story is all the different people who got inspired by it. People from all different walks of life, Black people and white people, and men and women. And so what I tried to do in the book was make each chapter about a different person. And I like that kind of ensemble aspect of it. So maybe it'll happen. Who knows? From this question at this webinar.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the other thing that's really interesting about this story, as we've sort of talked about before, is that Herndon is so young when this happens, and he is kind of buffeted. I mean, he is in certain points of his career, he's a very admirable figure because he's quite courageous to be so young, and he's in the middle of all this stuff, and he's, whether one agrees with his convictions or not, he has the courage of his convictions as a very young man. But he doesn't have much education, right? Like, tell me about his background, right? He's
right.
very young.
This is yeah. There's like a kind of a tricky points about Herndon. There's the two mysteries were kind of what happened to him right after the 1940s, and the second story was, is he really a son of a Cincinnati coal miner, right? And it's the great historian Robin D.G. Kelly was on to this, in a book chapter, and I was like, this doesn't seem right. If something didn't seem right, First of all, Angelo Herndon is an alias, right? He takes his mother's maiden name as his last name. This is very common among communists who don't want to endanger their families, right? But his real name is Angelo Braxton, right? And he's from the Black Belt in Alabama. He comes from a family of sharecroppers, right? His father escapes sharecropping and does go to Cincinnati, becomes a coal miner, contracts pneumonia and dies, right? And so, but that's when Herndon is like 3, right? So at 3 years old, his father has died. His family did not move up with the father to Cincinnati, as far as I can tell, by looking at city directories and that sort of thing. And so he kind of hides his origin story. And so when the papers write about Angelo Herndon, they write about him. They call him, he's referred to always as the Cincinnati Negro, quote unquote, right? But he's not from Cincinnati. It's kind of a dodge. And there's some things in his autobiography that kind of try to take people off the trail, right? He didn't work in a coal mine in Lexington, Kentucky. He worked in one in Birmingham, Alabama, which makes more sense. And so he's really an Alabaman, and he really understands, I think, the deep injustice and poverty that Black people were experiencing in the rural South. And one of the things he was going to do after his autobiography was write a book about sharecroppers, and he never did. He actually had a contract from Random House to write a book about sharecroppers. And so you can see that, and he traveled the country while he was out on bail, to your point, trying to free the Scottsboro Nine, right, to raise money for them and to meet with Tom Mooney, another communist, falsely, wrongly imprisoned, right, in San Francisco. So, he's really the world's his oyster there for a while. But his origin story, he lied about it. He lied about it for a really long time. And some of his FBI files and Alabama birth records and other things really helped me nail down that he was definitely born and raised in Alabama to a big family and really knew grinding poverty with, as you said, almost no education. His early letters are really painful to read. Early letters in prison, but he educates himself and he gets education through the Communist Party.
Okay, so I think we have time for one last question because we're just about out of time. So our last question will be, what was the most interesting or surprising thing that you uncovered in your research for this book?
I think the biggest shock to me was that he was, convicted of, a federal crime of fraud in Chicago, right? Running a kind of real estate fraud on people, and it was disappointing, and but it was just where the story kind of led and where the facts kind of led, and so that was really quite shocking. But I think from like a legal perspective, since we're at the Supreme Court Historical Society, was one of the most interesting things for me was Charles Hamilton Houston's efforts to file an amicus brief on behalf of the NAACP. And at the time, to file an amicus brief before the Supreme Court of the United States, you needed the consent of both parties. And the NAACP sent A.T. Walden to the county prosecutor to try to get consent. And A.T. Walden wired back, no. And Houston's like, well, I'm not taking that for an answer. And so he then telegrams the Attorney General of the state, and he says, the Attorney General says, well, that's not in my power. So Houston then files with the court and says, look at this telegram. They've tacitly consented to filing the amicus brief, and Chief Justice Hughes, who's a real racial progressive, in my opinion, lets Houston and the NAACP file the brief. I really love that story because I think it sort of encapsulates what a great lawyer Houston was, and about how all of the rules about how to argue before the Supreme Court and advocate the Supreme Court. Today we have a flood of amicus briefs. Anybody almost can file an amicus brief. And then it was a real struggle for the NAACP to chime in on Herndon's cause.
Okay. Well, that's great. I think Jennifer Lowe is going to come in again and sort of take us out, but it's just been a pleasure to talk to you today. It's been a pleasure to read the book. And I hope everybody in the audience purchases and reads a copy because they will enjoy it and they will learn a great deal.
Well, I just want to thank you, Ken. It's so nice of you to give me some of your time to do this. And I hope people, if they want to read more about Charles Houston and a young Thurgood Marshall and Ben Davis Jr. and other Black lawyers, they should read Representing the Race because it's an amazing book.
Thank you.
Thank you both. This was a terrific conversation, and you guys could go on for another hour, and I think we would all still be engrossed. Copies of Brad's book are available to order from our gift shop, supremecourtgifts.org. So take a look at that and see if there's anything else you might want while you're there. And our next event is on February 24th, William Causto will be speaking about Chief Justice Oliver Ellsworth. The link is on our website to register, supremecourthistory.org. Thank you, and we are adjourned.